I think we're ready to begin now. It really is my great pleasure to welcome Debashree to give this talk. I think we all know her. That she doesn't really need an introduction because of just how important Debashree has been to so many of us in different departments, different fields. But I do just want to say very briefly that Debashree's work on film and the way that she tries to integrate different modalities of film, the visual and the sound and the political dimensions of film and filmmaking have really been very instructive to me, and I think for quite a number of you. As you know, she is assistant professor of film and media in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies, MESAAS, and she is currently completing a manuscript, and I think this is your talk is from this manuscript, on Bombay Hustle. Great title, Making Movies in a Colonial City. And this manuscript provides a practice and a practitioner-oriented history of the consolidation of the Bombay cinema industry. And this I didn't know, that Debashree had worked in film and television beforehand, and it is that experience that has also gone into her academic study of film. She edits the peer-reviewed journal Bioscope, South Asian Screen Studios, and she has curated archival exhibitions of film ephemera and photographic objects. So the title of the talk that she's going to give today, as you will see from this really vivacious poster, is Impassioned Speech, Talkie Cinema in Colonial Bombay. So thank you, Debashree.
Thank you so much, Gauri. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. And also, I think congratulations for also initiating this new phase at the South Asia Institute, where we are welcoming some of our own to come and present on campus, because it can be hard enough for all of us to connect and learn from each other. So I really appreciate that. And it's also great to see so many of you in the room. Some of you are familiar with very early drafts of this project.
Repeat audience.
Repeat audiences. Yes, Parth was definitely one of those that returns. So one of the most loyal box office returnees. So I've changed the title a little bit. It is, as Gauri said, chapter 3 from my forthcoming book, and it's on voice and thinking speech. So to begin without further ado. So in her memoirs, the actress Hansa Vadkar recalls working with the German director Franz Osten at Bombay Talkies studio in the 1930s. Now, Franz Osten did not speak Hindi Urdu, and he would always close his eyes during a take, just as the clapboard was struck. Now, puzzled by a director who wouldn't visually observe his actor's performance, Hansa Vadkar finally questioned him one day. And this was his response. Photography is the cameraman's job. How you act is known to me through your articulation. I have already explained the action to you. The force of your words tells me how you are acting. So my presentation today is an attempt to think about the role of speech in early talkie films from India. How do we apprehend the force of words in Indian cinema? Austen's reply to Vadkar points to the embodied nature of voice, the corporeal quality of enunciation. Sound transformed the career of cinema in India. From its novel status as a locally produced entertainment form, which was available alongside Hollywood stunt serials and urban theatre, cinema became the reigning cultural imaginary of 20th century India. The success of the talkies is commonly attributed to the subcontinent's traditional interest in song, with the commonly held view that into the new medium of cinema came a river of music that had flowed through unbroken millennia of dramatic tradition. Now today I want to look at a different element of sound, newly emergent on the public stage in late colonial India. the emphatically public form of the impassioned, speechifying voice. An aesthetics of passionate oration defines the first phase of sound cinema in India, a time when actors' own voices were recorded live on set, a time before playback recording and dubbing. A noticeable declamatory emphasis emerges in films of this period that helps us understand something of the continuing reliance on dialogue in mainstream Indian films. So this scene from Devdas is just one example of 100 scenes of impassioned, what is called in India dialogue delivery, which is so crucial to the formation and the maintenance of stardom in commercial cinema. And I've chosen this particular sequence because of Shah Rukh Khan's drunken soliloquy, which is premised on the structure of courtroom argumentation, which is what I will end the talk with. I connect the declamatory drive in 1930s Talkie films to a thriving public culture of political and pedagogical speechmaking in late colonial India, arguing that the Talkie transition must be heard from an intermediate perspective. Based on a survey of surviving as well as lost films of the 1930s, I note that early Talkie films frequently featured recurring dramatic scenes of energetic oration, be it in the form of principal speeches or arguments in courts of law. These cinematic stagings of affective vocality regularly mobilized women's sounding bodies to highlight the performative logics of argumentation. Sonic imaginations are fundamentally relational. Sound in cinema is a sonic phenomenon that draws on conjunctural acoustic practices and is thus not a discrete thing in itself. Diverse acoustic ecologies proliferated in late 1920s and early 1930s South Asia, inhabited by multiple communities of listeners and heterogeneous practices of listening. Growing up in Peshawar in the 1920s, the legendary actor A.K. Hangal recalls an urban environment saturated with multilingual entertainment forms that bypassed the popular versus elite cultural divide. While Hangal's father and his friends frequently hired professional singers for collective listening sessions, Hangal himself spent hours in Peshawar listening to dramatic dialogues at the Parsi theatre shows that were put up by traveling troupes. Song and speech, entertainments that relied on feudal and urban economies of patronage and consumption, coexist in his memories of Peshawar with premonitions of an Indian Talkie cinema to come, which would draw on each of these forms. Further south in Bombay, mill workers' sense of hearing was getting permanently dulled by the constant rattle and clatter of machinery at which they labored during the greater part of the day, and nationalist activists were being arrested for singing revolutionary songs in early morning Prabhat Feri processions. Technological mediations of the human voice multiplied during this time. In 1924, more than a decade before All India Radio's Bombay station was consolidated, which is 1936, an intrepid group of radio, telegraphy and telephony enthusiasts set up the Bombay Radio Club in Apollo Bandar. Though received with enthusiasm by Bombay residents, the idea of a sound source completely disconnected from the original scene of the production of live sound took some getting used to. For example, when a radio dance program was proposed as the main entertainment at the Grand Hotel in 1924, it created a stir because patrons and dancers were somewhat shy of the idea of a hidden band. So the idea was that at one of the dances at the hotel, they would not have a live band, but they would play sound from a radio. And dancers were reluctant to go up to the dance floor. The dancers were unable to dance to a band that they could not see. This shyness towards disembodied sound emanating from a metal contraption was a repeat phenomenon across the subcontinent because access to gramophones and radios was only slowly starting to grow. But gradually, listeners learned new cultural techniques and they attuned themselves to imagine the voicing body beyond the machine. This is a history of what I'm calling acousmatic attunement, and it allows us to revisit the cultural significance as well as the affective pleasures of the talkie film in India. Now, theorized in depth by Pierre Schaeffer and Michel Chion, the acousmatic is a sound whose source remains unseen, such as off-stage voices used in theatre and off-screen sound used in film. The radio, the telephone, and gramophone can be considered acousmatic technologies because they transmit voices separated from the images of the bodies. In the 20th century, and it was funny for me to have to write down in the 20th century, you could not see your friend's face when you called her on the phone, nor could you see Noor Jahan when you played her record. Regular use and enjoyment of these acousmatic media normalized the separation of sound from image, as listeners no longer required a unified sounding object, be it a human sounding source or a musical instrument, no longer needed to be visibly present in front of them. Acousmatic attunement thus emerged as a cultural technique, a learned ability to be alive to the hidden source of sound and to simultaneously discount its ocular absence. In urban India, the systematization of acousmatic attunement was accelerated during the historical and technological juncture when new media such as the radio, telephone, and the public address system all started to overlap. On February 6, 1925, a large crowd gathered at the Victoria Terminus station to witness the inauguration of the electrified harbour train line. 3 of the inaugural speeches at this inaugural event were amplified via loudspeakers so that the entire crowd could hear the speeches as they were being delivered. Now, though these were spoken in a shared space, the speeches heard by the crowds had an uneven relation to the bodies of the speakers and the listeners. Some listeners could directly see the dignitaries, while most others could only hear their words through the distortions of loudspeakers. Moreover, the Bombay Radio Club transmitted the speeches through telephonic landline to their studio from where the speeches were rebroadcast over the radio, further widening their address and multiplying the communities that were joined by their mediated access to these voices. As a media event, and this is 1925, the multiple relays of these speeches mark a very potent social and perceptual shift in attitudes towards ideas of liveness, immediacy, and acousmatic listening. To ventriloquize Chion, something new made its entry with these modern technologies, and whatever the difficulties in naming and defining it, we cannot say that things were like they were before. Distant listening and distant speaking were a defining experience of life in the city. Talkie cinema picked up on the romantic possibilities of telephony, framing it as a modern device that could help lovers transcend social codes of rectitude. A song from industrial India from 1938 explains this. Come, my love, come, let us say something into the phone. Why do you shy from saying what is in your heart? I am not by your side, so there's no reason to blush. Let us speak from afar. Right? So in the Hindi it says, आओ आओ प्रियतम आओ फोन में हम तुम कुछ बोलें इस तार से दिल के तार मिला हम अपने 2 दिल खोलें जो बात छुपी तेरे दिल में वह कहती क्यों शर्माती हो यहाँ पास नहीं जो शर्माओ फिर दूर से क्यों नहीं हम बोले. So the speaker's persuasion strategy depends on the assumption that the voice on the telephone is disembodied, dislocated from the body of the one who speaks, and therefore beyond the jurisdiction of social and moral propriety. Nevertheless, his shy lover intuits that the mediated voice carries something corporeal with it wherever it goes. Now, Roland Barthes calls this something the grain of the voice, or the body in the voice. The corporeality of the voice cannot be disavowed. It sticks to the mediated voice. You listen not only with your ears but with your whole body. To hear, therefore, is to feel. This persistent corporeality complicates the idea of acousmatic attunement and reminds us that the mere separation of image from voice cannot erase the body and affective meaning. This is why a telephonic exchange can become the site of erotic drama. It is important to note that in India, technologies of sound transmission and reproduction were imagined primarily as having collective address and reception. Due to the high costs of individual radio sets and gramophones, these devices were often used at public venues and framed as community listening technologies. To think these technologies as public media rather than devices for private sonic consumption compels us to think of the radio, gramophone, loudspeaker, and cinema as public institutions that are addressing and producing collectivities of listening publics. In the eyes and the ears of the colonial administration, these listening publics soon transmuted into agitated listening crowds. So this is the next section. On March 14, 1931, Ardeshir Irani released South Asia's first talkie feature film, Alam Ara. The very next week, on March 23, 1931, the young revolutionary Bhagat Singh was secretly hanged along with his comrades Sukhdev and Rajguru. Now, apart from the coincidence of the month, is there any other connection to be made across these two events? Now, Bhagat Singh himself was a cinephile, and Daniel Elam has recently suggested that Bhagat Singh might have modeled his revolutionary avatar after the screen icon Sulochana. In fact, Bhagat Singh's disguise after the shooting of John Saunders in Lahore might have been inspired by Sulochana's chameleon act in Wildcat of Bombay. Now, such an assertion cannot be decisively proved, but it remains a tantalizing suggestion that draws its power from the idea that cinema and revolutionary politics in this period might have had a rather direct connection as interlocutors positing complementary visions of alternate futures. And in Bhagat Singh's diaries, there are mentions of course, his use of the magic lantern, his visits to film screenings, his use of film synopses in political meetings, and his admiration for Sulochana.
So all of these are Sulochana in
This is all Sulochana in Wildcat of Bombay. These images are from a 1930s remake of Wildcat of Bombay. Both of those films are lost films. Now, the evening before the hurried executions of Bhagat Singh and his comrades, public meetings and processions were organized in Lahore and Bombay. By the end of the month, so-called seditious speeches were being delivered across the country, urging the youth of India to avenge the execution. Even the Conservative Congress, staunchly opposed to violent political action, witnessed so-called excited speeches at its plenary session, where a resolution dealing with Bhagat Singh's execution was passed. Quivering with excitement from head to foot, and in a voice full of emotion, the Pandit appealed to the House to pass the resolution. A live, impassioned speech performance such as Nehru's was the reigning register of political oratory in late colonial Bombay. Sumit Sarkar has framed vernacular political oratory in early 20th century India as a major communications revolution, suggesting that the impassioned speech form enacted the systematic interpellation of the people, a key diacritic of political modernity in general. So political oratory and the more extended field of seditious speech in late colonial India offer us a very exemplary case to study the construction of a split between sound and noise that has been elaborated upon by various sound scholars, including Jonathan Stern. So the same speech forms that were heard by sympathetic listeners as rousing, sincere, and fundamental to the nationalist imaginary were configured as noisy, dangerous, and unlawful by the colonial authorities. Now, once this sonic split between noise and sound was in place, the colonial apparatus could further categorize populations into regulated subjects versus unruly mobs. An increasingly nervous British government responded to the proliferation of nationalist, communist, and anarchist revolutionary speech by intensifying censorship and bringing in charges of seditious speech against public leaders. Now, Bernard Bate has shown that the focus on exact words to incriminate critics of the colonial administration led to the development of shorthand as a mode of recording and surveillance in late colonial India. Now, such a transfer of speech to textual inscription was already encoded in Pittman's early descriptions of shorthand, which were first advertised as soundhand, phonography, and writing by sound. But again, something elusive was always missing from the shorthand transcriptions and courtroom revocalizations. So the transcriptions into shorthand were meant to be evidence to prove in court that something seditious had taken place. But the performativity of the voice, the affective registers of tone, timbre, volume, and speed, the clearing of throats and the raising of the voice, pauses, and emphatic exclamations, all of this would be missing in the textual transcriptions of the police, rendering the affect of oratory unavailable for colonial surveillance, inaudible to the disciplinary apparatus. On the other hand, newspaper reportage of sedition trials created an interested reading public for the consumption of speeches. Even defense statements such as Bhagat Singh's own statement in front of the Lahore High Court were published for sale and circulation. And you can think back to Tilak's trials in 1908 with about 20 hours of cumulative live speech in court, which were also published for readerly purposes. So if the colonial disciplinary ear couldn't tune into the affective charge of the embodied speech performance, perhaps the enthusiastic reader of printed speeches heard something else. So again, an acousmatic attunement allows readers to imagine the body behind the textual inscription, the speaker behind the screen. The body hovers over the page, inflaming the words and the imagination. Speeches and lectures were a recognizable genre in early 20th century urban India, and they freely traversed mediatic boundaries. David Leleweld has written about the genre of the Urdu speeches or lectures, which were printed texts of public orations by prominent speakers. This indicates a reading public for a spoken form, gesturing to the existence of reading practices that were attuned to the performativity and personality of a speech. For how could one enjoy the force and authority of a lecture or a political speech without imagining the grain of the voice? So these promiscuous media crossovers premised on the speech form were only heightened with the consolidation of the radio, gramophone, and film economies. And here's just an example of a gramophone record of Subhash Chandra Bose's recorded speech from around 1936. So speech is clearly moving via various media forms and various media circuits. Now through the 1930s, sound in Indian film was recorded as sync sound. And we still use the term sync sound today, which is live synchronization, sound recorded on set or on location. Playback singing, dubbing, elaborate background scores, and Foley design, which have now become synonymous with mainstream Indian film production, only came into use in the 1940s. So the time we are talking about is pre-playback. Early talkie actors had to sing their own songs and speak their own dialogues. Even music orchestras were recorded live on set as part of the diegesis, as part of the narrative, or they were hidden off frame. Sync sound technology altered the relations of the human body with the filmmaking apparatus and produced a new repertoire of cultural techniques. Actors were forced to rethink acting in terms of embodied vocality. So here's a quote from Jairaj saying, "I was made to stand in front of a gadget called the microphone, and that seemed to make all the difference between an older epoch and a newer epoch." Theatre artists and gramophone singers whose vocations depended on the use of the voice now joined the talkie industry, while film actors from the silent period retrained themselves in Hindustani speech, precise enunciation, voice modulation, dialogue delivery, and basic singing skills. For actresses, the parameters for cinematic suitability shifted from the photogenic face to the mic-suiting voice. And mic-suiting is a term that comes up a lot in the film journals of the period. Now, what this points to is the fact that the new on-screen human voice was not direct but mediated, just as ephemeral and mass-reproduced as the actor's on-screen body. The synchronization of the voice and body did not yield the real body, of course, but the representational body. As sound scholars have pointed out, voice itself is a notoriously elusive entity to define, with an ambivalent ontological status. The human voice possesses an ambiguous materiality, says Ana Maria Ochoa, because the voice is materially constituted simultaneously through the body by means of vibrating vocal cords, and also the world by means of the air that makes the cords move. And yet the voice does not fully belong either to the body or the world. It's somewhere in between. So in highlighting the in-between status of the human voice and the in-between status of the acousmatic voice in cinema, what I want to stress is that the voice in cinema, at least for a certain period of time, was the site of a speculative modernity that enabled new imaginations of the self and one's relation to the world. This was just to give you a sense of the body facing the mic and the mic-suiting voice. And now to the next section. Now, one of the fundamental paradoxes of the popularity of sound cinema in India had to do with the body of the singing, speaking film actress. In the years of silent cinema, Bombay's emerging film industry tried very hard to distance itself from the tainted female dancers and singers who were among the pioneers of Indian cinema. With the turn to the talkies, a newfound industrial need for attractive and trained voices announced the re-entry of the Baiji, who threatened the public space of cinema with a new kind of embodied acoustic charge. Performers from the techno-aesthetic industries of salon singing, urban theatre, and the gramophone business provided a ready-made workforce for this transition. And Jadan Bhai is one of the exemplars of making a very successful transition from salon singing to becoming a producer, director, screenwriter, one of the first music directors of South Asia, and an actor. She reinvested her wealth from her earlier singing days in film and was able to have complete creative control over the films that she made. So performers like Jadan Bhai provided a very ready-made workforce for the transition to sound. Talkie cinema needed the actress. Talkie audiences were obsessed with the actress. But society, a very pet topic for Hindi cinema, Samaj, was unable to accept her vocation. Now the human voice carries intimations of the whole body with it. A female voice conjures up the whole woman. In India, acousmatically attuned listeners were culturally trained to detect inflections of caste, class, regional, and even religious identity in the voice of the singer, making socially conditioned assumptions on the basis of things such as nasal tonality, pitch, throatiness, and pronunciation, and making generalizations about the identity of the voice that employed these registers. Now, because female singers and stage actresses had such a negative social status in colonial India, the filmic female voice took on a moral edge that became apparent in the very first months of talkie production. In June 1932, the Lahore-based Elephanta Movie Tone started shooting a talkie film, and 1932 was one of the first talkie films made in South Asia. A film called Pak Daman Rakasa, or Innocent Dancing Girl, starring Miss Shireen Bai, Miss Farhad Jahan, Miss Naz Begum, and a host of other well-known singers, musicians, and dancers of northern India. And by northern India, what they often mean is particularly Lahore and places like Hira Mandi. Now, that same month that Park Daman, that the Innocent Dancing Girl is released, we see this woman, Miss Nalini Tarkut, who always announces her name as Nalini Tarkut BA because she's got a bachelor's degree, shot the film Sacred Ganges for a Lahore-based director. Over the years, Tarkut would try to position herself as a modern Indian girl who was breaking the taboo in Hindu society of joining the film industry and who believed that good birth alone counts in the choices of actors and singers. So as the daughter of a judge and an educated upper caste woman of so-called good birth, Tarkut sought to distance herself from other Baiji actresses and consolidate her own industrial position on the basis of religious and vocational pedigree. So in this light, the title now and the purported content of this lost film, Innocent Dancing Girl, performs a public rebuttal of such ideas, a defensive argument for the innocence and unsullied reputation, Park Daman, right? Not only of the fictive dancing girl heroine, but also the real life actresses Shireen Bai, Naz Begum, and Farah Jahan. Such legitimizing mechanisms, both at the narrative and the publicity levels, were becoming increasingly urgent in a public sphere that resounded with anxieties about the morals of professional female dancers and singers. Industrial strategies to contain public concerns of immorality were fraught with contradictions. Film magazines stirred audience expectations by labeling debutante actresses as a well-known songstress of Kashi, well-known HMV gramophone singer. At the same time, editorials decried the influx of songstresses into the film industry. Actresses and also actors were often profiled in film magazines in terms of ethnicity, religion, and education to cater to the speculative curiosity of readers and viewers. Of course, performers were able to use social knowledge and frustrate its aims by manipulating vocal codes or masquerading under assumed vocal identities. But this also led to another peculiar situation, as some actresses tried to perform oral respectability rather too enthusiastically. And this is an editorial in the first issue of this magazine called Rang Bhumi, in which they say a new problem has now appeared. Nalini Tarkut, again, who belongs to a very respectable family, has refused to use words such as beloved or dearest during her scenes. The film producer is in a real dilemma. Silent Pictures never had a situation like this. It is only with the coming of talkies that such difficulties have arisen. We doubt whether any lady from an upper class family could address any man in such terms unless he is her husband. But nevertheless, from the point of view of art, it is not inappropriate to utter such terms of address. Now, these comments attempt to reconcile deeply entrenched ideas about ideal femininity rooted in class expectations with the urgency of artistic progress. And of course, cinema at this time, there's a major industrial program to assert respectability by aligning cinema with art or a high cultural form rather than its status as a mass cultural low form. So in the final section of this talk, I will now look at some films that directly confront these dilemmas through plot, characterization, and dialogue. So the last section is on courtroom films. And I'll begin with a very rare screenplay fragment, which actually gives us dialogue from a film that is lost. And this is the fragment. So Leila, the female barrister, says, "Honorable judge and members of the jury, the accused is said to have murdered her lover, and the accused is another woman, Devika Rani. I agree with that statement. However, my claim is that she did what was right. That she killed a man is not a crime. Had she not killed him, that would have been a crime. It is every mother's duty to safeguard her child's life, and under such circumstances, the accused has done what any mother would do." Now, the film is titled Mother, and all we have are a few still images and some screenplay fragments that help us reconstruct a sense of the film. and we also have a synopsis. But what is clearly evident is that this courtroom scene was the climactic moment in the film. And it's a short film, it's not a 2-hour feature. It was part of a double bill, both films made by the same studio. One, a tragic film, and I can't do a spoiler alert, you're never going to watch this film. Devika Rani is hanged at the end of this film. And the second part of the double bill is a comedy, also featuring Devika Rani. So film after film in the 1930s features women advocating for themselves or for their loved ones through impassioned speech. From Shanta Apte's fiery discourses in Duniya Na Mane, which you can see on YouTube, to fearless Nadia preaching to villains, fathers and lovers alike, the consolidation of female talkie stardom was premised on speech. Of particular interest is the recurrence of the courtroom as a space for agonistic dialogue and excited speech in the 1930s. In films, so this is just a snapshot of the number of films I've been able to identify as featuring a courtroom scene very centrally in its denouement or its climax. So and these are all films featuring lady barristers. In films such as Miss 1933, where Glorious Gohar pleads her own case in court, and the case is she's accused of murder in self-defense. Film like Bharat Ki Beti, where Ratan Bai masquerades as a man to depose in the courtroom. Mother, where Manika defends Devika Rani in a trial, and it turns out that they are estranged mother and daughter. Where Sabita Devi in Jeevan Lata argues the case for her lover in court, actresses often played what were called lady barristers, and most frequently their narrative role within the film's epistemic worlds was to contest the societal and colonial legal ideas of morality and justice, asking probing legal philosophical questions such as, who is in a true sense responsible for the murder? Now, this is a question repeatedly asked by revolutionaries in their defense, as seen in this doubly translated text of Bhagat Singh's statement in court, where he asserts that what is at stake is a question of righteous motives, something that is impervious to punishment. And then to see another screenplay fragment from the same film Mother, where the accused mother is saying, "No, father, I'm not afraid of death. How can a person whose life has been one long nightmare be afraid of death? I have never been enchanted with the body. It will be destroyed tomorrow, so why not lose it today?" Now, what's interesting is that the presence of women at public rallies as well as courtroom trials was frequently reported on in newspapers, but only in connection to gendered stereotypes of feminine bodily excess. Women were reported as fainting on seeing Bhagat Singh's father and Rajguru's mother mount the podium during a meeting on March 30th. Similarly, much ado was made of the hysterical behavior of Batukeshwar Dutt's sister, who apparently screamed and shouted in the courtroom, pouring abuse on the magistrate, the police, government, and all their generation. Now, unnamed across newspapers, Batukeshwar Dutt's sister is only defined as a woman whose cries continued for a fairly long time. She was forcibly removed from the courtroom, and henceforth no more women were allowed inside the courtroom for the rest of these trial proceedings. Now, the gendered discursive treatment of politically active young women can be read as a strategic response by the government and sympathetic newspapers, who were alarmed by the emergence of the educated middle-class woman as a visible and dangerous actor in the independence movement from the 1920s onwards. And Durga Ghosh has written an excellent book on this. So how do we then think about cinema's embrace of the declaiming, argumentative female voice? There are several ways to think this question, especially if we concentrate on the technological promise, the aesthetic meaning, and the industrial agendas of embodied speaking and acoustic listening in the 1930s. Firstly, the gendered history of the voice in society and culture assumes voice as a conduit to self-truth, an emblem of the rational democratic male agent. the grainy corporeal voice and material vocality has been historically rendered feminine, at least in the Western imagination. Women's vocality is stereotyped as inarticulate, bodily, and excessive, rather than efficient, rational, or logical. The early talkie films of the 1930s collapsed these binaries, as female-speaking subjects present rational arguments in impassioned registers. The rational versus the irrational, bodily versus intellectual, male versus female are coupled and decoupled on the same audiovisual body, because often we have the same actress in a double role across generations performing a murder or then defending herself, or mother and daughter across generations meeting up in court, one a defendant and one a lawyer. Further, we have to consider this as a cinematic extension of the use of impassioned, excited speech in mass political platforms and public venues, albeit by male speakers. Second, to characterize the acoustic ecology of this period as acousmatically attuned is to highlight that audiences and actors were attuned to the slippages between machines and bodies, between the on-screen and the off-screen, voice and body, even in an era before playback recording. And I say this because the bulk of the scholarship on sound in Indian cinema has been dedicated to playback recording and how playback really kind of institutionalizes the separation between an on-screen woman and an off-screen singer. And what I'm suggesting is that kind of split and attunement was already in place before the era of playback, because you don't really need the split across two separate women. In fact, the technological apparatus would often show itself accidentally in out-of-sync shots and sequences, or clumsily visible orchestras on screen, or a microphone hanging into the frame. So these accidents are also ways of basically, not deliberately, but inadvertently making audiences doubly aware that this is mediated, recorded, and split voice, sound, and body. An awareness of the separation between recorded sound and recorded image, human body, and machinic mediation can be seen in a clip from Jeevan Prabhat, which is a film from 1937, which relies very heavily on silent film visualizations of sound. So what I want us to look at in the clip is, this is a 1937 film, so it's still pretty early in experiments with talkie cinema in India. It's using off-screen sound, so what technically would be acousmatic sound, which is you will hear a sound, but the source of the sound will not be on the screen. But the bodily gestures and the amount of silence used in this sequence harks back very strongly to silent cinema aesthetic modes.
अब तक मेरे लिए तुम थी, अब तुम और ये दोनों। पद्मा, तुम खुश हो? हाँ दीदी, बहुत। उन्हें
to basically give you a sense that that this is a film made in 1937. It's 6 years of talkie film production, but all of this is taking place in complete silence, with actors indicating off-screen sound through gestures, through bodily gestures of listening, pointing, and looking in a particular direction. You will never see the baby, because of course you can't, they don't have a baby here for you to see. But all of this to indicate that even in the talkie imagination was still trying to grapple with thinking about how to indicate off-screen sound, even when the image and the sound could be coupled, is using a lot of silent film registers. Because audiences are very much trained already in listening for or imagining the sound that they cannot see or that they cannot hear. So it doesn't make much of a difference at this point. Okay. So I'll just leave this here and to wrap up. Now, Mary Ann Doan reminds us, and I quote, "As soon as the sound is detached from its source, no longer anchored by a represented body, its potential work as a signifier is revealed. There is always something uncanny about a voice that emanates from a source outside the frame." Close quotes. Now, in the courtroom scenes of the 1930s, we see a younger generation of educated barrister ladies defend an older generation of courtesans and public performers. So often the woman that's defending, that is the accused, is a courtesan or an actress or a public performer who has committed some crime in self-defense. And the woman that's defending her is an educated lawyer. The very grounds for argumentation in these scenes is social stigma versus moral value, with the courtroom being judged incapable of dealing with questions of motives and ethics. Often two models of femininity are presented within the courtroom that correspond to the coexistence of two actress types and actress demographics, because college educated Nalini Tarkhud backed BAs were also working in the industry at the same time alongside by Jaddan Bai. Now, rather than signaling an erasure of the socially marginal female actress, the early talkie industry struggles to contain competing claims on its actresses. Thus, the courtroom can be seen as a platform from which the industry publicly argues the case for hiring stigmatized female bodies and voices. There is therefore an industrial logic that drives this claim to legitimacy. This is most pointedly exemplified in the film Jeevan Lata, where a barrister hero, so male barrister, disdains his heroine's love for dance, and he is disgusted when he sees her at a public performance. But when this male barrister is wrongly accused of murder, the dancing girl comes to his defense. And I mean this very literally, because it turns out that the infamous dancing girl also has a law degree from Oxford. So the courtroom film in pre-independence India locates the problem of a vocal female talent pool in the actress's singing voice, but uses her speechifying voice as the preferred register to address and possibly resolve the problem. It highlights the complex claims made on talkie actresses, who were at once real women playing fictional characters, Indian women performing tropes of ideal femininity, and modern women embodying the technological and social promises of the cinematic age. In the thick of these paradoxical pressures, the 1930s actress as a film worker was enjoined to present her own case. Films premised on litigating female protagonists and testimonies from female defendants serve as a clever commercial ploy by filmmakers to capitalize on the provocative reputation of actresses, right, by having an entire narrative with singing and dancing, but also narrativize their struggles for a vocation. Acousmatic attunement, or an awareness of a split between image and sound, which also recognizes the corporeality of the voice, has profound implications for a sensory, material, and a technical history of sound in Indian cinema. It allows me to recover the actress's body as a laboring body, and the viewer's ear as canny and trained. Because the acousmatic is not limited to film, and because sound cinema in India benefited from the growing presence of different acousmatic media, the phenomenon of attunement opens up film historiography to the materialities of synchronous media practices. Acousmatic listening presumes that meaning is unstable, and that identities are performative. The film actress, in all her glorious, polyphonous social presence, was central to the consolidation of Bombay's talkie industry. And she was met halfway by India's canny audiences, who intuited the altered possibilities for the self in a mediated and technologized modernity. A culture of acoustic attunement accounts for the excitement of seeing the synchronized voicing body on screen, but at the same time, it creates a fantasy space where mediated female bodies could offer multiple visions of performative becoming. So just the last thing I want to leave us with is that, interestingly, by the 1930s, it had become fairly routine to read about film actresses embroiled in real-life court cases in the daily newspaper. So from accusations of cheating and breaking contracts to divorce and defamation cases, actresses were often defending themselves publicly in the off-screen courtroom. So with that, I'll end the talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Debashree. I think we have some time for discussion.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, and I have so many different questions, and maybe I'll just list them and you can just choose which ones you want to answer. One I'm quite struck by, it always strikes me when I think about the 30s, how distinct that moment is compared to once you see post-independence. I'm thinking the fact that, the sheer volume of films where women are the protagonists, and, all what you've laid out versus like what you see like after independence, you just don't have the same kind of, and I'm just wondering what you speculate, what that is connected to. And the other thing is, of course, this narrative of respectability is such a long-standing one, right? Things that I found in my own work in the 90s, people were still trying to be respectable, so it's interesting like how that narrative has been so predominant, and I think it finally gets resolved sometime in the 2000s, I would say. But it's interesting. I was wondering if you could, so like the fact that the films themselves like shift to becoming much more male centric. I'm wondering if the connection, if one thinks about respectability, if there's a way to kind of think about those things. And then the other question is just about. It's interesting, the speeches, right, that you were mentioning, because you're having fragments of screenplay and not the actual films. I'm wondering if you found any material also, because since these are all, you're laying out a really nice soundscape of political speeches and then similar types of things happening. What's going on with censorship? I'm wondering, like, if these types of impassioned speeches, they may have been in the screenplay, would they have ever made it, to cinema? And I'm wondering, in the kind of historical work, in the archival work, like, if you ever found any discussions about, the speeches being cut, things like that.
Yeah.
I will leave it at that. It's up to you, whatever you'd like to.
So I'll actually start with that last one. So it's interesting, I just wrote this article on thinking about looking at censorship files as a way to think and re-examine lost films. So a film that I was writing about from 1936 called Mill, written by Premchand, most infamously, because he threw his hat in at the end of it and was like, done with the film world. But it was censored for being communistic. Like many films in the 30s were being picked up on for this communist themes. And that film is a lost film. But there's such an extensive paper trail of the kinds of cuts that were requested and re-requested across a period of 6 years of it being constantly proscribed and re-proscribed. And there are speeches there that are being cut, because there are speeches which are saying things the censor board is saying things like, this speech is meant to agitate the proletarian mobs, this speech is meant to inflame. So the speeches are being considered to be directly inflammatory. And in the end, under a new Congress regime, after the 37 Bombay elections, new speeches are added which say things that the Congress government wanted to hear. Mahatma Gandhi ki Jai, Swaraj, and this and that, which were not there in the earlier film. So speeches definitely are very important for political contestation at this time. And the women question, that's a very, very big question. Why is it that so many of these films and so much of the film economy in pre-independence India really depended on the female star? And why is it that 1950s onwards we see the male star? Something definitely shifts in the economics of the film industry. I think in the 1950s there is more tighter control of certain studios and the field of production, and there's a rise of this group of what we all consider the male auteurs of the glorious 1950s, but who also have a great stranglehold on production, distribution, and reception. So Guru Dutt, Dev Anand, Dilip Kumar, they are also creating a certain monopoly economy, and the male star kind of comes to the fore. So there are various other questions there, but also to do perhaps with the singing star and her decline. The only male star at this point that's comparable in any way to the women is K.L. Sehgal. Everyone else is the second lead pretty much till 1947. Yeah.
There's just so much to think about and to ask, but there are two things that particularly struck me when you were describing the ways in which speeches that are there in films then kind of get extracted and become part of publications and reach a reading public. I think that's a very interesting generic shift, and it struck me as very really, really fascinating that there's a kind of editing process that is going on between the various genre, that it's as if there's a kind of slicing process that is going on with the films and with these speeches that are just extrapolated from the films and then get published as speeches and then circulate within the public and become and then they take on a different life altogether. And it's that move that I found very interesting. And I mean, I don't know if there's a question that I have here so much as to observe the editing process that is going on in what you're describing. The second is really more of a question, because I was when you talk about this disembodiment and the imagining of sound, I was wondering whether there is something like a continuum between dance and film, where dance can imagine a scene without actual sound, and how that kind of performativity extends into the film, and how many of these actresses were actually dancers at one point, if that's data that you have already been working on.
So that's great, actually, because I think what you're pointing to with the second question is that the question that I begin the chapter with: what is it that talkie cinema brought to cinema? Right, because you did have silent cinema was a very noisy place. People were reading out film intertitles in the room. People were able to basically see mouths moving and read what they were saying. People were dancing without synced sound, but there were orchestras often or other kind of live music accompaniment in the theater. So it's not as if cinema was silent before the talkies. There were all these ways in which sound. And there a lot of these women were, more women hired in the talkie transition were singers, trained singers, because their voice and the kind of oral training is what was most desired at this time. Some of the dancers that come into prominence at this time fall into two categories. One are Kathak trained dancers, and one are self-styled dancers who are inventing some new kind of film form which brings in a little bit of that Uday Shankar style of Indian choreography and something completely invented. Madam Azuri is one such person.
No, Bharatanatyam.
Not in the Bombay scene. That definitely happens in the Madras scene. So yes, so there's, I think what you're pointing to is exactly correct. Whether it's singing or dancing, there is music in the theatre in various forms. The disarticulation of all these forms has already existed for a long time. So even for the silent film, so a very important print object that also comes into its own after the talkie film is the song booklet, which is a printed pamphlet with the lyrics with song lyrics printed in them, which become collectibles and people can buy them. They exist not only for you to memorize your favorite song, but because you're also buying the gramophone record of some of these films, right? So even if you've not watched the film, you've heard the song, or you want a collectible. And these film booklets are part of the annual registry of print publications that the Home Department surveils as printed texts to be checked for censorship, and it terms these film booklets as film books. So that's very interesting. Yes, Fran.
I'd like to continue that discussion of film pamphlets, because that's really ages ago what I did my dissertation on. And in the 1880s, when there were enough commercial printing presses available so that popular pamphlet literature really took off, it was notable that the very first generation of publications were things that had a guaranteed wide sale already. So they were very recognizable folk tales, and they had a traditional storytelling bias, dastans, qissas, that kind of thing. And I noticed that you said in the beginning of the tradition you were talking about, the very first example was called Alamara. And so I'm curious whether in general the earliest films start out with traditional, like Mughal style or courtesan style, or well-known stories of some kind that are then gradually evolving over time into things with female barristers and innovative contexts for bringing in modernity. So could you give a little idea of how the progression went?
So can we collect one more question? I saw Anna's hand in the back. Yes.
Just a question. As you just said, the silent films are really anything but silent. I wonder if the orchestras or singers, if they were there live, and that the audience could see them, and if so, what happens to the acoustic in these films? And the second is, are they linked to phonographic companies, or are the film companies the same as the record companies?
Okay, so to take Fran's question, that's actually a great question, actually very fascinating connection there between these early films. So there's been a lot of, there's an excellent book by Rosie Thomas called Bombay Before Bollywood, where she's basically dismantling this assumption that the earliest films in the subcontinent were Hindu mythologicals. And she's pointing to how some of the earliest silent films, and definitely into the 30s and 40s, were Arabian Nights fantasies, drawing on Dastan traditions and so on. And if we think intermediately between the history of cinema and Parsi theatre, of course it makes complete sense. Because what happens with the talkies is that not having trained personnel to compose music, to write dialogue, you go to the place that does it really well, and which is the Urdu Parsi theatre. For me, one of the continuities between that moment and the talkie film with the lady barristers is the use of a theatrical Persianate style of speechifying. So I have a section which I couldn't really discuss today, where I talk about how the courtroom film actually allows a space. There's a lot of discussion in the early talkie period about also this idea of what is Hindi, Urdu, Hindustani is a big muddle right now. Cinema that has chosen, like Bombay, Hindi, Urdu, is trying to define this everyday all India appeal Hindi language, which has to be bolchal ki bhasha, which has to be everyday speech. But the courtroom allows a space to have an ornate, flowery speech, which is called Adaliya Zuban, where you can still bring in those modes from the Parsi theatre. Because one of the things when any new media form is emerging or trying to consolidate its position, there's a whole lot of defensive work about distinguishing it from media, other media. So cinema, why is cinema not Parsi theatre? Because we don't use flowery, ornate language. We talk in this everyday language of the people. But the courtroom becomes a place, and you can see that in the fragments of the screenplays, that it's the same, it's that kind, it's legalese, which allows a particular register. So for me, that becomes an interesting continuity in that sense. And Anna's question, did you mean singers in the Talkie period?
No, before that. Were there singers before that, or orchestras, which is very common in other parts of the world, but I don't know.
So there were apparently some orchestras. What is most common is people reading out the intertitles or improvising. And another thing that I have noticed is mixed programs. So in the same venue, you can watch a short silent film followed by a dance by a woman, followed by a film, followed by a song played out by an orchestra. So you could have this discrete kind of multi-format thing. But singing over a film, singing with a film, I haven't really seen that. And the record, the history of the film song as gramophone record is also a bit patchy. I only know of one film company that had a direct tie-up with a new gramophone label, that's Prabhat Film Company. But it wasn't really that common a practice that every film would automatically have a record that would be issued. And none of the companies I know had their own record label. They would definitely spend some resources in making sure they had good recordings for labels that approach them. But they're still pretty disconnected. And I think that the acousmatic question, the way I'm trying to think it, is a highly muddy space. There is no one way to think of, which is why I keep coming back to the body, which is that there is an attunement, there is a training of the ear and the imagination to imagine something, not be dependent on the coupling of sound and source, but at the same time there is this constant dependence on imagining that body. And there is some gap over there, which is what I'm trying to think as a space of possibility. And also for those that are not familiar, one of the things I'm responding to is a way of writing about Indian cinema at this time as a very steady kind of a move from the disreputable courtesan actress to the Nalini Thakur, the educated actress, and a very successful kind of purging of a particular actress demographic, which is clearly not the case when you look at who are the women on screen. It's very mixed. But I'm trying to find an acoustic history that also corroborates or helps us understand that plurality. So, yes.
I wondered what the connections might be to the same process going on outside of India, because this is going on everywhere.
Yes.
And for Americans, there's Singing in the Rain.
Yeah.
But I was also wondering, because a friend for my own research sent me to a book called Bombay Foxtrot.
Yeah.
And
Taj Mahal Foxtrot.
Taj
Mahal Foxtrot.
What?
I think it's called Taj Mahal Foxtrot.
Yes,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
In which you have American jazz musicians in Bombay as part of that scene and growing passion for that kind of music in the same period that you're talking about. So it is somewhat of an international scene in Bombay itself as it's going through this very important transition from silent to talkie. So I just wondered international things you could bring in to on the fringe of your story?
No, so you're absolutely right. I mean, if I were thinking of, so the jazz story is one of the ways in which I'm interested in thinking that how can we think of a history of sound in film when we think more than film. Then we start to hear in our histories all these other sounds that are part of this ecology that is informing sound in film. So it's not like a sudden transition from silence to sound. So of course the jazz and all of this is a part of Bombay's soundscape. In terms of speech, what's interesting is again, courtroom dramas become so huge in the 30s and 40s in Hollywood. But again, male lawyers all defending this idea of democracy and the ordinary everyman. So something very interesting happening in the 30s also by maybe saying Marxist would be saying too much for them. Slightly leftish leaning. That use the courtroom drama as a way to kind of create the sense of this is American values, American ideals, and part of it is a jury system and argumentation that's available. So speechifying and the courtroom film, much has been written about it. What's very, very exciting is to see that it's women that are doing it in Bombay cinema. We all know Avara. We know Nargis in Avara. And we think of, but that's another very exceptional kind of a moment. Something different is happening in colonial India, where it's women defending other women. So the hero is not Raj Kapoor or themselves. It's not, you're not defending Raj Kapoor, the good son, bad son, in this triangulated patriarchal structure. There's something else working here. Yeah, yes.
Two very minor points. Completely unrelated to in your slides. It's interesting you had Jadan Bai as 107 years old.
Oh.
So I'm not sure if that's correct. It said 1842 to 1949.
Yeah, it might have been a typo.
The other more interesting, which isn't a typo, is industrial India was translated as Nirala Hindustan. Nirala, which is not Sanati. So it's Nirala means unique.
Sanati?
Sanat means industrial. So it's how this translation takes place. And Nirala means unique or curious. It doesn't mean industrial. So it's again very interesting. The types of audiences that we're looking at, those who can't read industrial, they see Nirala Hindustan and you go and see that movie expecting something different. So
that's great. I have a long discussion on that translation choice. Because I'm trying to think also in the book, what is it that it means to translate industrial as Nirala? And there's a whole discussion that I do about thinking the place of industry and science in the cinema of this period. But the scientific as the industrial takes on something as an aura of the Nirala.
Certainly.
The adbhuts, the magical.
What does it say in Hindi? What's the translation? Is it from industrial?
It's Nirala. In the film. So these titles are given by the filmmakers. They are all issuing double titles for each film. So Mother, the film that we talked about, its Hindi title is Mamta. Industrial India is Nirala Hindustan. And some of them have even more distant kind of connections. Yes.
Number of things. It's a wonderful discussion, and I look forward to reading it and thinking about it more. One issue is, which has come up, is the relationship between the theater, the Parsi theater, and the film. So and I don't know enough about actresses on the stage, but we have a character in the Parsi theater of Shakespeare's Portia as a kind of model of the courtroom drama. And that's what students studied in school from Shakespeare, but then it's, I think there's a Parsi theater version of it, and I...
Became a film also.
Yeah, it's Aga Hashar Kashmiri. And so there is this continuity, and so I'm trying to think about what is it in the film that makes the point you're making of the disembodiment that isn't on the stage, and that connection. And then going to the other end, we have the radio. And the radio is coming up at exactly the same time, a little bit later actually, except for the little Bombay station. And on the radio, there are women's voices, not many in the 30s. You only get women doing the news, I think, after independence, or maybe just before. But you get people making speeches and doing dramas, women's voices, and so you have the possibility of women's voices being performed. Then there's one other issue, which is that in the Bombay movies and also the Pune movies, almost none of these people were Hindi speakers or Urdu speakers, and they had coaches come down from the north to teach them how to speak. But if you hear Dura Kote speaking Hindi, it's a kind of neutral, let's say, accented sort of thing. That might work better for declamatory as opposed to the representation of natural speech, of day-to-day speech, Rosmana Bolchar, as you say. So I don't know, there's those thoughts.
That's great. I mean, the talkies also then necessitated all these new profiles that had to suddenly emerge. So the dialogue coach became a thing. So there were people that were hired to basically read scripts and dialogues, to coach actresses. Like Devika Rani spoke English, French, German, maybe a little bit of Bengali, right? But she was doing some of the first big Hindi Urdu hits of the time. And Franz Austin not only closed his eyes because he was hearing the force of the words, he didn't understand Hindi or Urdu. He only spoke German. I think he had a smattering of English. So there's a lot of very interesting kind of playing with all these gaps between meaning and intention and language and text and registers. Sulochana is one of the few Anglo-Indian or Jewish actresses that makes it to talkie films. Most of them can't continue because they are unable to have the right diction. I'm not sure about the impassioned speech allowing a space for discounting some of that accented problem, but I'll think about it some more. Radio, yes, the women's voices are mostly singing voices. And a lot of the women singing on radio at this time are actually from film and theatre. And they're advertisers. Come and hear it in the Bombay broadcast, so and so, who you will know from the screen. And there's this crossover between those.
But there's also the radio talk, and some of the people who gave radio talks were Sarojini Naidu, who was a famous orator, and what's her name? They're anyway.
So the talks are a big thing. So radio is full of talks on very specialized subjects by specialists. Most of the Bombay radio stations talks I've seen have been mostly by men. What's also interesting is to think of the female lawyer again in the world, in Bombay, and people like Cornelia Sorabji, who apparently get anecdotally advised, do the office work, you don't need to do the argumentation in court. And all of this is all public knowledge. Like there's discussions about Cornelia Sorabji, there's discussions about these film screenings, all in the same newspaper. And it's interesting that film is creating this space over and over again for a certain kind of not actually existing woman, right? Which is very interesting to think of that need. So I'm trying to think of it, okay, there's an industrial reason here to actually argue for a right to work. But there's also something else that the woman means across cultural forms in this moment of this final phase of the nationalist movement, where the woman has come on to take so many different kinds of political, affective, nationalist charge. So something interesting there. Yeah. Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, we have also run out of time. So please do join me in thanking Debashree for this very rich and very, very interesting